So this happened last year in Virginia, and is also the reason I never backpack alone anymore. I was taking summer courses at the time, and we ended up with a 3-day weekend in June. So I thought it was a great time to go explore some of the Virginian wilderness. I did a Google search, found a state park with a trail that looked nice, and let my roommate and family know the trail I was going to be on. When I got close to the park area, I saw a little outdoor shop where people hiking the Appalachian Trail stop. I went in to grab a map of the area, just in case I got lost. As I was talking to the owner, he mentioned a trail that's not well known that has a pretty cool waterfall and a swimming hole. This piqued my interest, so I had him show me on the map. It took me outside the state park, but he said it was a great place to go. I paid for the map and thanked the owner. I texted my roommate and my parents about the new trail, and I parked my car and set off on my adventure. I should note that the waterfall was going to be a side trip from my journey. I was planning 3 days and 2 nights. I started on part of the Appalachian Trail, and it was pretty packed with people, and some of them are really fun to talk to. As expected, I got further and further from the main trails, and I saw fewer and fewer people. Around early afternoon, 3 miles from my destination, I noticed it was unnaturally silent. No birds, no bugs, not even wind, and I had the distinct feeling of being watched. I shook it off as me overanalyzing the situation. I got to the waterfall, and it wasn't too spectacular, but it was cool to look at. Plus, it had a good-sized area to swim in, so naturally I stripped down to my skivvies and took a dip. It was pretty refreshing. As I was getting my clothes back on, I started whistling to myself. That's when I heard something whistle the same tune back. I thought it was a bird copying me, so I went back and forth with it, and it would repeat whatever I whistled. I thought it was pretty neat. As I was setting up camp, I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being watched again. Like I would get goosebumps, and my hair would stand up on end. As night fell, I built a small fire and lit my jet boil to make some dinner. As I did this, I became hyper-aware that again, there was no sound, just deafening silence. Some part of my brain was telling me that I wasn't safe and that I should leave. I ignored it and crawled into my tent with my flashlight and book. I went to sleep without incident. When I woke up the next morning, my sight was trashed. My camp stool was nowhere to be found. My bear bag with my food was cut down, and the contents were thrown across the site. My first thought was that a crafty animal had chewed through the rope and got the bag. But I looked at the rope, and it was cut with something very sharp. Plus, none of the food was even touched. I also noticed bare footprints, human footprints, all around my campsite. Keep in mind, I'm at least 6 to 8 miles from any road. As I was looking at the mess, I heard a branch snap off in the distance. I turned to look in that direction. I saw nothing, but I heard that whistling again. My whistle from yesterday, but it was different. It sounded more sinister. It made my hairs stand on end, and this is when I listened to my instincts to get the hell out of there. It sounded like it was a little off in the distance, so I packed up my camp as fast as I could. As I did, the whistling got closer and closer as I finally finished stuffing the tent into my bag. I didn't even bother with putting anything away properly. I just wanted to get out. The whistling was incessant and sounded like it was coming from all directions. I got fed up with it, and finally I stood and yelled into the woods, "Shut up! What the hell do you want?" It stopped whistling, and it was quiet for a moment. And then it repeated everything I had just said, in my voice. It sounded just like me, but distorted, like it was coming from an old television. After I heard this, I immediately threw my pack on and ran in the direction I'd come from. I heard it moving just behind me, fast, switching between the whistle and my voice. It felt like it was toying with me, not coming too close, but never being too far. Eventually, it sounded like it got farther and farther away from me, and then it suddenly stopped. When it stopped, I stopped and turned around. I wish I never had, because I heard the most bone-chilling screech I've ever heard, coming from right next to me. That's when I started running again. I didn't look, I just ran. Less than a half mile, I ran into a couple that was also backpacking. They saw the look of terror on my face and asked if it was me that had screamed, and asked if I was okay. I told them about what happened, and they decided not to go down from where I had just come from. We moved to a more populated trail, and as quickly as we could, all got the hell out of there. As soon as I got back in my car, I drove to one of the park's ranger stations and reported what had happened. Since the site was off park grounds, they told me it wasn't in their jurisdiction, but that they would send a ranger to investigate. The ranger station's parking lot runs right up to the woods. As I was getting into my Jeep, I hear the whistling coming from the woods, just in front of me. Strange Occurrences in the Woods by Camrania Dilbert, posted to r/paranormal. I live in Illinois, and I've posted about other haunted locations before, such as Bachelor's Grove Cemetery, but one of my friends and I were discussing an experience that we had in the woods, and were looking for some answers. The first event happened in late August of 2016, while we were running late one night. We both ran cross-country and track in high school, and we still do to this day. My friend worked a job that wouldn't get out sometimes until 10 or 11 at night, so we would typically go running very late at night. This had been happening for a couple of years at that point, so we knew our path very well. On the local running path, down 2.5 blocks into the woods that butts up against a large creek, you could sometimes see houses and a park through the trees, but at other points on the path it started to get a bit more secluded. We aren't talking like the wilderness here, but just more secluded. There is wildlife in the area, mostly raccoons, skunks, too many close calls there, a random beaver and the occasional deer. Over the years we have seen more and more coyotes around in the streets, but never in the woods. Given our location, there isn't a local bear or wolf population, and this is a critical detail to the story. We meet to go running one night at about 11:15 or 11:30. I'm not entirely sure of the exact time, but it was fairly late, and thunderstorms were on the way, according to the weather app. For this reason, both of us left our phones in the car. The one time we have, and we've regretted it ever since. And we decided to run pretty fast to make it back before the storm. In the woods, it's mostly a wood chip trail, until it gets to about 200 meters from our turnaround spot, a water pumping station, as the town has had flood problems recently, where it turns to asphalt. We run to the turnaround spot and start running back, as this was about a quarter of a mile from the wood chips to turn around and back. I would estimate it took around 2 or 3 minutes given a slight stop at our turnaround. On our way back, we noticed what we could only describe to this day as an upside-down trash can with a fuzzy or blurred outline in the middle of the path right before it transitions into wood chips. If I had to guess, I would say it was about 3 to 4 feet tall, on the shorter side. Again, I need to stress that this was only 2 to 3 minutes after we had first run by and come back to that exact spot. This thing had appeared there in that short time period. We stopped running, as this was rather peculiar, and it wasn't there when we'd run by the first time, but we continued walking closer. We thought maybe somebody had moved something in front of us as a prank, as the only people that frequent the woods other than us at that time are other teenagers, smoking or drinking. But they're loud and they can be heard from very far away. This thing was dead silent, and we had continued to get closer until we were about 50 feet away, and then it started to move. When I say move, it was standing still, but as if it was swaying part of its body completely left and then completely right. We had seen a red glare on either side when it turned its head, like the lit end of a cigarette when someone inhales. Not a very bright glow, but enough to be seen in the pitch black as there were no lights in that area. Talking between us, we began to become very uneasy, as this was unlike any person or animal behavior we'd ever seen. This thing made no sound, and we were worried that it was some dangerous animal or something, so we started backing up slowly and made a run for it. It did not follow us, but it stayed in place, moving in the same manner. We ran as fast as we could back to my car and drove over, arriving approximately 25 to 30 minutes later as the storm started to come in. No rain, just lightning. Looking around, though, we found no trace of it whatsoever. No broken branches in the woods, no footprints, nothing that would lead you to believe that a large creature in the woods visited us. Neither of us could explain it, and after failing to find an observation, we just tucked the experience away. Fast forward to the end of December of that year, we were on another run, one of our first at night since the incident, and when we got to the pumping station, we found a disturbing sight. We discovered what appeared to be a dead deer leg lodged in the chain link fence, pretty much completely picked clean with the exception of some skin and hair and hooves at the bottom. The whole thing was pretty intact from thigh to hoof. Shortly afterwards, I decided to bring a different friend to these woods who has the ability to see spirits, to see if he could discover anything, but I didn't tell him any of the background or why we were going there. As we walked by the spot that we saw the trash can thing in, he was startled and focused toward the woods. I asked him what was wrong, and without me telling him any other information prior to our arrival, besides, "Oh, this is kind of a weird area sometimes," he described a cloaked figure around the same height as what we had seen, with beady red eyes staring us down. He said once it noticed that he could see it, it ran away quickly into the woods. In the weeks afterwards, my running friend was back out on the trail, only to discover multiple other bones that we believed to be missing parts of the dead deer. He first discovered a spinal column with rib ends just laying in the grass next to the pavement in the woods. He carefully moved it to be with the other deer leg to keep track of them all in one place. 3 days later, in the same exact spot, he discovered what appeared to be neck vertebrae. And then a few days after that, in the same spot, he discovered another bone, one which we don't know what part of the body it came from. At first we thought wild animals when we experienced this creature, but these other occurrences lead us to believe that something paranormal was happening in those woods. Does anyone have any explanation for what might be happening here? I cannot find an answer, and I'm desperate for any information whatsoever. Last summer, a good friend and I embarked on a backpacking trip through the White Mountain National Forest in New Hampshire. As fairly experienced day hikers, we felt comfortable in the Whites for our inaugural overnight trip. While planning, my buddy Ellis figured we could hike to a backcountry campsite to make our first wilderness night a little more fun. I wasn't going to disagree. Beautiful views, historic trails, and a protected night in the dry river wilderness. I was stoked to say the least. Before any hiking trip, I do a little internet search on the trails or shelters that I will be coming across. Throughout the mid to late 1900s, there were a series of these lean-tos up and down the dry river wilderness, meant for backpackers or through hikers really looking to escape the crowds in more popular areas of the forest. Though as time went on and the Forest Service had other more pressing matters, many of these shelters were dismantled, except for Dry River Shelter Number 3, the last remaining shelter in this wilderness zone. On the morning of our hike, I met Ellis at the trailhead, and we set off. The sky was overcast, bringing with it a dense fog throughout the forest. The weather left us with nearly no visibility, so there went our stunning views. At least the trail consisted of prime, technical New England rock scrambling alongside the river. Ellis and I made it up to the Presidential Ridge, stopping by the Lakes of the Clouds. The hut was filled with day hikers, backpackers, and through hikers, all socializing together. We were even rewarded with some sun and a brief glimpse of the Dry River Valley on the summit of Mount Monroe before the fog rolled back in. With dwindling views and a stiff wind, Ellis and I hustled below the tree line, down to the Dry River Shelter Number 3, our home for the night. Once we dropped off the ridge into the valley, we entered the wilderness zone where rangers patrolled sparingly. Time to really be alone in the wild. As we trekked into the wilderness, all signs of civilization disappeared, and the trail was densely overgrown. Although it had been raining all week, there were no footprints in the mud either. At least we would have some relaxing isolation, I figured. After about an hour or so of descending, Ellis spotted the lean-to just as our legs were asking for relief. A gorgeous old timber structure with a well-used fire pit alongside a cold mountain river. Pristine camping. As we settled in and explored the site, I found a small, bound notebook nestled into the corner of the structure. On the cover, someone wrote, "Dry River Shelter Number 3. Out of curiosity, I opened it, but I found nothing more than a lone man's name scribbled onto the first page, and a date. Just your standard camping log. Oddly, though, the man signed the book the previous day. We saw no footprints or signs of humans, or even animals. No disturbances on the trails or here at the shelter. The rain can wash away tracks, but not all signs of life. Something felt off to me. I showed it to Ellis, who found it curious, but thought nothing more of the single name. He convinced me that the man was probably a hiking veteran and a professional at L&T. I bought into Ellis's thoughts on the situation to ease my mind. As the sun set, we started a roaring fire alongside the riverbank. Ellis commented how quiet the location was, having not seen another soul beyond the chirp of birds since leaving the Crawford path. The silence was eerie, but we figured that city life had desensitized us to the wild. The sun was setting, and we grew tired with the darkness. Ellis took the lean-to, and I spent the night in my tent. Sleep came quickly after hiking over 8 miles with 20 pounds on my back, but this didn't last long. A brutally sharp slapping noise woke me. The only thing I could compare the noise to would be someone swinging a 2x4 into a tree or snapping a thick branch. I figured it was a bear searching for our food bag hanging in a tree some 20 to 50 yards away. Nothing out of the ordinary for New Hampshire. Sleep overtook me once again, and I remember waking up to the sun rising over the peaks. I stumbled out of my tent to see Ellis also waking up slowly. As we made our morning oats and coffee, I wandered around the site again to see if I could find the marks that the bear had left. Instead, I noticed something odd. The small notebook was open. I swear that I put it back where I found it, closed and in the back corner of the shelter, not open and on the floor. "Hey, Ellis, were you checking out this camp log last night?" "Nah, man, I passed out," he said. "It's not like there's anything to read in it anyway." "You sure?" I commented as I bent over to pick it up. The lone hiker's name was not so lonely anymore. At least 20 more names filled the pages. The lone traveler, whose name was originally on the first page, could now be found several pages deep into the notebook. I tossed it to Ellis, whose face instantly dropped the second his mind registered what he was looking at. Great. Now I knew it wasn't just some dehydration delusion of the previous day. Dude, we must have been seeing things last night, he said. There's no way we missed all these names. How could we? This is when I began to tell Ellis about the slapping noise during the night. I received nothing other than instant denial. These sounds were not the result of some hooligans or backward crazies harassing us. Ellis was convinced. Rather sternly, he said, "It's a bear, Jack. It's just a bear. Let's go now." And, well, go we did. Ellis led us out of the sight and on our way home not 10 minutes later. A year has passed, and I'm still not quite sure what happened during our night at the Dry River Shelter number 3. The memory of seeing a single name written on the front page of the notebook is so crisp in my mind. I couldn't have mistaken it. Could I have mistaken the noises I heard and the new additions to the book? Ellis feels the same way about the whole scenario. What do you think? Could we have just been too dehydrated and delusional and saw the same thing independently? Or were we not welcomed by the New Hampshire wilderness? "25 years ago, I moved in with my cousin and her roommate and coworker named Jose. The house was an old cement block, 3-bedroom, 1-bath house with a large fenced yard. He had 2 very large German shepherds that lived there and were mostly in the yard. The house is in Carmel, Florida, in a shitty, packed suburban neighborhood. Nothing special. Rent was cheap, $50 a week from what I remember, and the house was clean. Plus, my cousin lived there too, so I moved in. We all got along well. Everyone worked. We pretty much kept to ourselves and saw each other for a few minutes here and there. I lived there for about 6 months. This is the story of what caused me to move out. On a weekend night, we all happened to be off from work. We decided to invite some friends over from the pool hall that we frequented, and Jose invited some people over that worked at the pharmaceutical lab. There were probably 20 people there total. We played music and did what young people do. Eventually it got pretty late, and we found ourselves talking about ghosts. We all shared stories. My cousin and I came from a pretty spooky family, so we had some good ones, and everybody was really into the discussion. Jose was quiet throughout most of the conversation. He waited until we had all kind of quieted down, and then he said, "You know, this house is haunted." My cousin and I shot each other a look, and then both laughed because, yeah, sometimes Jose's 20-pound house cat would meow at the empty hallway, but other than that, that was it. He proceeded to tell us that there was a presence in the house, but that it mostly stayed in the shed in the backyard. This tiny little pink wooden shed that I had never even looked in. He told us he always keeps the curtains in his bedroom closed because his window faces the shed, and the door to the shed will not stay shut. He has jammed it shut 1,000,000 times, and it always pops back open. It creeps him out. He said he could tell when it was in the house because he would wake up feeling depressed. It creeped me out. I didn't want to think that I lived with a presence, and I didn't like the idea that it was hurting my roommate. I was a tough chick in my opinion, so I was like, screw that ghost. I'll shut that door, and you won't have to keep your curtains closed anymore. I said all this because in my heart, I didn't really believe that anything was in the shed or the house. I believed we were all just messing around. So I told them all that I was going to go outside to inspect the shed and deal with the door. Everyone followed me, and while we were walking around the outside of the house, Jose told me that it was a really bad idea to mess with the shed, that whatever it was wanted that door open, and I should just leave it alone. We all got out there, and it was exactly what I thought it was going to be. A very worn-down wooden shed that oddly kind of looked like a tiny house more than a shed. I looked inside and there was a busted lawnmower and some old paint buckets, rusty screens, and darkness. I looked around outside and found some rusty shovels in a corner of the garage. I took a shovel over to the shed. I kicked the door of the shed back into the frame. The door was closed and literally kicked into the frame, kicked shut. I took the handle of the shovel and I put it under the handle of the shed door. I shoved that into the ground. It was secure. We all went back inside. We BS'd some more, but it was late, I'm gonna say around 1 a.m. by the time we go back in and everybody said their goodbyes. We let the dogs out of their pen in the yard and locked the gate. We made sure that the front gate was secured so that they wouldn't get out, and then we straightened up the house a little and eventually we all went to bed. Sometime around 6 a.m. I woke up because I needed to use the bathroom. I opened my bedroom door and I was sleepy, but there was a weird sound as I opened it. It startled me. It was like fingernails scraping on something coarse. I opened the door all the way, and the shovel fell in the door and hit me. I can't even put into words how I felt in that moment. That shovel had been standing against my bedroom door from the outside, and there was a tiny pile of dirt where the tip had been sat against the tile floor of the hallway. I rushed through the house to the side door, which was locked, and then out to the backyard. The shed door was wide open. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I ran back into the house. I immediately pounded on both Jose and my cousin's bedroom door. I was terrified and angry because I absolutely knew that one of them had done this. Now, I know that you couldn't have been there to see the reactions, but I promise you, based on them, neither of them did it. Jose literally broke down sobbing. He begged me to tell him I was lying. He begged my cousin to admit that she had done it. When neither of us took responsibility, he went to the store and got a bunch of religious candles, produced a rosary, and started trying to pray away whatever it was, or pray for me for being dumb. My Spanish wasn't even close to fluent enough to keep up with his prayers. My cousin, on the other hand, was pissed. She was ready to fight me. She was adamant that I was pulling a prank, cussed me up and down, called me a liar, said I was a child, that most of all, she didn't appreciate being woken up at 6 a.m. after a night of partying to be a pawn in my prank. When I knew that neither of them had put the shovel against the door or reopened the shed door, I was literally terrified. There was no way someone else got into the yard, past the dogs, got to the shed door, opened it, got into the locked house, and then put that shovel against my door. I didn't sleep there again without someone else in the room with me. Every moment spent there after that was beyond tense. We all kind of stopped talking to each other, and Jose and my cousin ended up in a terrible argument over a button on the stereo of all things, and she moved out within a week. It took me 2 weeks to find another place to live, and I never went back. I grew up in a house on a rural back road, and looking back on it now in my adult life, I feel like there was a lot of dark energy in the house. There were a few events that happened to me and others while living in that house that I will never forget. This is one of the experiences that happened to my brother and I. For backstory, I lived in a very small rural city with 1,000 people on an island, in an area rich with dense forests, vast hayfields, and roads that go on and on to seemingly nowhere. Truthfully, I was a very strong-minded kid who, oddly enough, would adventure into the woods all day alone. Or we would play hide-and-seek outside at nighttime around our property. Some nights I would even go outside and just lay in my yard and watch the stars. None of that bothered me, but I was scared of my house. My little brother, who shared this one particular experience with me, slept with his bedroom light on his entire childhood. I spent a lot of time sneaking into my parents' room during the night to feel safer. I never liked going into the basement by myself. I avoided the wood room in our basement as much as I could, and I also didn't like being home alone. This whole event happened over 2 minutes on a summer day. I was 15 and my brother was 11. My parents were at work, which was normal. And I remember my brother and I laying on our couch. We were home alone, watching TV in the living room, and sitting about 6 feet away from the landing of a flight of stairs, which goes to the second floor. In my house, once at the top of the L-shaped stairs, there's a door directly ahead of you, a door to the right, and an empty hallway to the left with 4 other doors and other rooms. There's nothing in the hallway, just light bulbs and switches. While watching TV, I heard a noise upstairs, a muffled thud. Just the wind. That's what you instinctively tell yourself, right? We continued to watch TV, and at this point, my brother hadn't even acknowledged or noticed the first noise, but I had, because it was so strange. Then, the same sounding noise came again. It wasn't one single sound, but a couple of sounds tied together that made it seem more intentional. The noise wasn't anything I could pinpoint, but it did sound like a brief second of furniture moving very slightly. That was enough to scare me, and my brother could tell at this point that I was very focused on the stairs and not the television. These noises were not extremely loud, but definitely not something created by wind. I was nervous, and I muted the television for a moment, so the house was basically silent. After one more thud from upstairs, I was petrified, and I started to sit up a bit. My brother was also beginning to become more alert and nervous. I remember him saying something to reassure me, and we both sat up. He began to say something else as I was trying to listen acutely and figure out what the hell was going on upstairs. I snapped, "Listen." At that second, a much, much louder and closer series of sharp crashing sounds occurred. This time it was so loud and sudden that when it happened instinctively we both jumped up and started to run out of the living room through the kitchen as quickly as we could. We tried to run outside and get out of the house. I tried to open the door and it wouldn't budge, almost like it was locked. But it wasn't locked, because the knob still moved, it just wouldn't push open. I don't think that the door has ever acted like that before, or since. I started to run to the sunroom, where the French doors led outside, and my brother followed. While we both ran full tilt to the other doors, on the way I looked into the living room, and at the base of the stairs I saw an out-of-place faux glass drinking cup. I realized that it was the source of the last sharper crashing sound, because it had hit the walls in the staircase before tumbling down the last stairs and landing in the living room. Trying to figure out how it had gotten from a bedroom or bathroom to the bottom of the stairs still scares me to this day. I have no explanation of what created the energy to cause the noises, and for the glass to travel the distance it did. There was another strange moment in that event because when we got to the other doors, I'll never forget in the half second it took me to unlock that door. My eyes were locked on a housefly that was alive and buzzing inside the glass. It got smeared against the window pane of the door as if something had swatted it, right in front of me, but nothing was there. And even if somebody had been, nobody could have reached it because it was between the glass. It was so sinister and shocking to see the once living fly get smushed before my very eyes as if an invisible force had put pressure on it. When I opened the door, we continued to run barefoot the 50 or so feet as fast as we could to our neighbor's house, who's also my Aunt Michelle. We instinctively ran as quickly as we could, and we felt much safer there. We didn't bother to explain it in detail until my aunt asked what happened, and we just said something had scared us. I remember her laughing at us because she thought that we were overreacting. It was really hard to sleep in that house that night, and I bet my life my brother slept with the light on, and I did too. Maybe 5 years ago, we were talking about scary things amongst friends, and I asked him, "Do you remember the day we were so scared that we ran over to Michelle's house?" He replied laughing with, "Nope, we were scared a lot back in the day." I left it at that. I'm staying at his condo right now, and he's sleeping beside me peacefully, with the lights out. I'm tempted to ask him again what he remembers from that day, or any of the things that he remembers happening in our home, but I don't want to bring it up. I want to keep those memories out of his head, and I think he does too, and I definitely don't want new memories in mine. A lot of times, I wish I didn't remember some of the things, because I don't like revisiting those memories myself. But that house, and that day in particular, was terrifying. The lights went out at exactly 8:17 p.m. One moment, my living room was bathed in the glow of the evening news. The next, pitch black as the TV blinked off. Great, I muttered, fumbling for my phone to use its flashlight. Power outages were common enough in the rural town of Haven, especially on muggy summer nights like this, when everyone's AC was cranked up high. I flicked on my phone's flashlight and did a quick sweep of the house. Yep, everything was dead. Lights, appliances, the ambient whir of electronics. Even the streetlights outside were dark, leaving the neighborhood shrouded in an eerie dusk. A chorus of neighbors shouting queries and complaints echoed down the street. My wife and I joined in, hollering from the front porch to see if anyone knew what had happened. The unanimous verdict was a substation malfunction. An inconvenience for sure, but nothing we small townfolk couldn't handle with a little patience. I headed back inside to light some candles. As I turned to shut the front door, a flicker in the sky gave me pause. I peered out. Was that a plane flying overhead? But no, it was too large and silent, more like a drifting cloud backlit by moonlight. Except the moon wasn't out tonight. The hair on the back of my neck prickled as I craned my head to follow the object's path. It wasn't alone either. 2 more huge amorphous shapes drifted into view, emanating an otherworldly green glow. They were definitely not clouds. A primal unease stirred in my gut, whispering, "Get away," telling me I did not want to know the nature of those shapes in the sky. "Honey," my wife called from the kitchen, "could you bring in some more candles?" I lingered a moment longer, uneasy gaze fixed overhead. The shapes continued their silent traverse, showing no signs of stopping over our small town. Some kind of military aircraft, maybe? But what were they doing out here in the boonies? "Did you hear me?" My wife appeared behind me, her voice sharper. "What are you looking at?" I don't know," I stammered, pulling my eyes away. "Weird lights in the sky. Military planes, I guess." Her eyes narrowed as she scanned the horizon. "I don't see anything." A lame joke about my eyesight was on the tip of my tongue when a thunderous boom rent the quiet night open. We slapped our hands over our ears, ducking instinctively as the windows rattled. Car alarms whooped a chaotic chorus down the street. Dogs howled, and alarmed neighbors stumbled into their yards. "What the hell was that?" my wife shouted over the din. Through the open door, we gaped as an enormous green fireball roared overhead, arcing toward the woods at the edge of town. It disappeared behind the trees with an earth-shaking crash, leaving silence and swirling ashes in its wake. For the space of a few racing heartbeats, no one moved. Then our neighbors began shouting questions back and forth, asking if anyone had seen what had happened, if everyone was okay. I shook myself from my shocked stupor. "I'm calling 911. I announced, reaching again for my phone. But when I tried to turn it on, the screen stayed black. I smacked it against my hand a few times, to no avail. Power's still out, my phone's dead. Can I borrow yours? It's dead too, my wife said. What did we just see? A meteor, maybe? Some space junk? I said. I peered uneasily up at the night sky, but it was now empty of any unexplained lights. Only a wispy trail of smoke snaked above the trees, marking the object's landing site. As I wondered aloud who might go to investigate, the streetlight suddenly flashed back on. A cheer went up from the growing crowd of residents now congregating on porches and sidewalks, glad to have light and power again after the disturbance. My phone vibrated in my hand as it rebooted. Before I could access anything, it began pinging and buzzing with emergency notifications from the county. I quickly scanned the flood of headlines demanding people stay inside and lock their doors and windows. Local emergency services were being overwhelmed by panicked calls, and law enforcement was struggling to maintain order in neighboring towns amid chaotic reports of strange lights in the sky and unidentified crashes. Officials were advising everyone to remain calm and stay put until the situation could be sorted out. Easier said than done, as panic was already rippling through our small community. More meteors and unidentified objects continued streaking overhead every couple of minutes, adding to the confusion and fear. Against official recommendations, some neighbors were hunkering down in their basements, while others were piling into cars and peeling out to flee town. I wanted desperately to believe there was some rational explanation, that this was all just a cosmic coincidence of space debris falling at once. But an increasingly insistent voice deep inside whispered that this was only the beginning of something far more sinister. My worst suspicions were confirmed minutes later, when a bone-rattling roar echoed from the woods, like the shriek of a gigantic metal beast. The ground vibrated beneath our feet, as the trees themselves seemed to shudder and recoil from whatever was approaching. From the billowing smoke lumbered an enormous tripedal machine, easily 5 stories tall, its massive metal hull wreathed in a menacing aura. Searing red lights flashed from its joints as it strode into town, swiveling a lone eye to survey the panicked prey before it. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from the merciless gaze of the alien invaders. I stood frozen, mesmerized by abject terror, as the machine raised one colossal limb and took aim down the street. This happened when I was in middle school. I'm about to graduate high school. I still remember every detail to this day. When I was younger, my mother sent my siblings and I to this cute little summer camp in the mountains. It was 1 week in the middle of nowhere. No cell service, no quick way to reach anybody, and we were miles and miles from the nearest town. This event happened in my 3rd year of attendance. The way these campsites were set up goes as follows. You were split up by gender and age group. Each campsite had 4 cabins with 5 raised beds in each, and 1 lean-to for the assigned camp counselor. So in your cabin, you got 4 buddies that you get to know fairly well throughout the week. There's also no bathrooms at the campsites, so if you had to go, you would have to get the TP from your counselor and go into the woods. We were about 12 at the time, so we always had to go with a buddy. This one night, a girl in my cabin, who I had become pretty close with throughout the week, was just talking to me in the dark of our cabin about absolutely nothing. Just 2 kids who couldn't sleep, so we opted to stay up and talk until we could sleep. Eventually, she tells me she has to go to the bathroom and asks if I'll go with her. I say yeah, no biggie. So we grab our flashlights and sandals and hike over to get some TP, and then we go back past our cabin. Ours was the farthest out, on the edge of our campsite, a good 20 feet from the other cabins, and we go a little ways into the woods. I stand on the path while she goes up into the trees to do her business. Again, we're 12. It's cold, and we're both afraid of the dark. So she asks me to keep talking to her so she doesn't freak herself out. So we're talking about nothing, and I'm doing that little step dance you do when you're cold, swishing my flashlight around to see if I'd find anything cool. I almost never go to the mountains, and I just wanted to know if there'd be any cool plants or animals that I could see in the distance. I stop as my light lands about 13 feet away from me. I was dead in my tracks. To this day, I don't know what else to describe this thing as, other than the description of the rake from that creepypasta story. I know how childish that sounds, but it's the only comparison I had in my head. It looked freakishly lanky, extremely decrepit, pale, hairless, like a person, but definitely not a person. I could only see its head, shoulders, and from its forearms to its fingers, it stretched out as if it was crawling down the path. It had long, spindly fingers that seemed to sharpen at the end. I really don't know if I was looking at nails and claws, or if its skin was just stretched like that. Its head was pointed slightly downward, and I would later figure that it was as if it was trying to avoid the light beam. But I could still see its eyes. Eyes that still make me shiver if I think about it too long. Large, black ones. I don't know if it was extremely dilated pupils, or if its eyes were just black. But it was like the eyes themselves bulged out of its head. I was too scared to shine my light any farther, and I could see one of its hands slowly creeping toward me. I was petrified in my spot. I didn't move my light off of it once I saw it. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't going to just leave this girl out there if it actually was something that might have hurt her. I told her to hurry up. She asked me why my voice was shaking. I remember saying, I don't want you to freak out. It's probably nothing. I'll tell you when we get back. But when you're done, just tell me. Because we're going to make a run for the cabin. Okay? That really made her move. I felt bad for scaring her, but I myself was terrified. I heard her say, "Done," and I just told her to run. I spun around, finally taking my light off of it, and sprinted so quickly that I caught up to her in seconds. This might have been my own heartbeat pulsing in my ears, but I was sure I could hear it almost galloping behind me. We were both moving so quickly that we slipped a bit on the leaves in front of our cabin door. I remember two of the other girls waking up when the door slammed behind us, as I fumbled with the hook that would lock it. I don't really know how I thought that would help, though. It was a poor lock. My friend was freaking out, asking me what I saw, and practically begging me to tell her I was pranking her. I couldn't say anything, though, as I had begun to have one of the worst panic attacks in my life. My breathing became audibly labored, and someone had to get up to get our camp counselor, which is what got me talking again. She got about halfway to the door before I said, "No," and that was what made everyone more freaked out. Eventually, our counselor heard us and came to the cabin. Someone opened the door for her and she came in, wanting to know why I was crying so viciously and why everyone was panicked. I was able to piece together a coherent enough sentence that she got the gist. Obviously, she didn't believe me, who would, but she finally gave up on trying to convince me when she offered to go with me to confirm there was nothing there, and I just kept crying harder at the thought. I slept in the lean-to with her for the rest of the week. I'll be the first to admit that I can't honestly know what I saw. I was 12, it was dark, and I was tired, with probably an overactive imagination. But I know that staring off into the dark has never struck such terror into me like that before. I know that figure that I saw. I just don't know what to call it. I still don't really know what to make of it, but I think about it every summer. The 13th Floor Isn't What It Seems by Elevator Enigma. I work in a fairly typical office building in downtown Seattle. It's one of those generic high-rises with mirrored windows, a sterile lobby, and elevators that always smell vaguely of someone's lunch. Nothing special, really. Except for one small detail that's been driving me absolutely insane for the past few months. Our building has 12 floors. At least, that's what it says on the fire escape plan, what's listed in the directory, and what shows up on the elevator buttons. But sometimes, and I swear I'm not making this up, the elevator opens to a 13th floor. The first time it happened, I thought I was just tired and had miscounted. I was working late, trying to finish up a project before a big deadline. When I finally called it quits around 11 p.m., I got in the elevator and hit the button for the lobby. The ride down seemed to take longer than usual, but I was so exhausted I barely noticed. When the doors opened, I stepped out without really looking. It took me a few seconds to realize something was off. The lobby looked wrong. The lighting was dim and yellowish, casting long shadows across the floor. The usual security desk was missing, replaced by a tall potted plant I'd never seen before, and the air felt thick and stagnant, like walking into an attic that hadn't been opened in years. I turned around, confused, and saw the elevator doors closing behind me. That's when I noticed the floor indicator above the elevator showed 13. I frantically jabbed at the call button, suddenly feeling very uneasy. When the doors finally reopened, I practically dove inside and mashed the lobby button repeatedly. Nothing happened for a long moment. Then, the elevator lurched downwards with a sickening drop that made my stomach flip. When the doors opened again, I was in the familiar, brightly lit lobby I knew. The night security guard gave me an odd look as I stumbled out, probably because I was sweating and looked like I'd seen a ghost. I convinced myself I had just dozed off in the elevator and had a weird dream. But then it happened again. And again. Always late at night when I was working overtime. Always when I was alone in the elevator. Sometimes I would catch glimpses of shadowy figures moving at the end of long, unfamiliar hallways. Once, I heard what sounded like muffled conversation coming from behind a door marked maintenance, but the voices stopped abruptly when I approached. I've tried talking to building management about it, but they just give me blank looks and insist there is no 13th floor. I've asked my coworkers if they've experienced anything similar, but they either think I'm joking or look at me like I'm losing my mind. Maybe I am. Last week, curiosity finally got the better of me. When the elevator opened onto that impossible 13th floor, I decided to explore. I stepped out into the dim hallway, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure somebody would hear it. The carpet beneath my feet was thick and muffled by my footsteps. As I moved farther from the elevator, the air grew noticeably colder. I passed door after door, all of them locked. Some had nameplates, but they were in a script I didn't recognize. At the end of the hall, I found a large window, but instead of the expected view of downtown Seattle, all I could see was a dense, swirling fog. Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching from around the corner. Panic seized me, and I sprinted back to the elevator. Just as I reached it, I caught a glimpse of something. A tall figure, too thin, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned bellhop uniform. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I had the distinct impression it was grinning at me. It might have been humanoid, but whatever that thing was not human. I jabbed frantically at the elevator buttons until the doors finally opened. As they closed behind me, I heard a soft, raspy chuckle. I had been somewhere I shouldn't have been, somewhere that I didn't belong, and something up there knew it. The ride back down to the lobby felt like it took hours. I've been avoiding working late since then, but sometimes, when I'm leaving the office at a normal hour, I swear I can hear that same chuckle coming from the elevator shaft. And occasionally, just for a split second as the doors are closing, I'll catch a reflection in the mirrored walls, a figure in a bellhop uniform standing right behind me. But when I whirl around, there's never anyone there. I don't know what's going on in my building. I don't know if I'm losing my grip on reality or if there's something genuinely supernatural at work here. All I know is that I'm terrified of what might happen if I ever encounter that bellhop face to face. And I can't shake the feeling that sooner or later, it's going to step into that elevator with me. I don't know what to do in the meantime, but I know one thing. I think I'm going to start taking the stairs. When I was a teenager, my family moved into a new house in Ohio. Well, it was new to us. As soon as we moved in, my mother started saying that she felt the house was haunted and that she could sense a presence there. She said she heard somebody call her name and felt somebody put a hand on her shoulder. One time, she woke up with somebody holding her feet down, and she couldn't shake off whatever it was, so she started screaming. She also heard muffled voices. We didn't believe her at all, until both my sister and I started experiencing strange things. My first experience was when I was reading a book in my bedroom at 3 a.m. I'm a night owl, so this wasn't that unusual. Everyone should have been asleep, but suddenly I hear very heavy footsteps right outside my bedroom door. They were too heavy to be my mom's or my sister's, so I just assumed that my dad was walking around, checking up on us. I sprinted to the door, and when I opened it, I was shocked to discover the hallway was dark, and nobody was up. Our attic had several feet of fluffy insulation, covering the entire area. There was nothing stored there, but at times you could hear steps coming from the attic, running up to the side of the house. They always ran up to the side with the driveway, as though they were trying to see who arrived, and this happened almost every time that somebody would pull up to the house. In the daytime, it was almost cool, but in the nighttime, it was terrifying. There was always something clicking loudly under my bed and in the closet at night, and I always tried to convince myself it was the air vents. However, all the air vents were on the other side of the bedroom, and they never made clicking noises. I sometimes saw an outline of a person standing next to my bed if my head was covered with a sheet, but when I pulled the sheet off, nobody was there. I heard sighs, as though somebody was standing right behind me, and one time I heard a whisper that said, "Come play." I prayed a lot, and that usually helped. I would also ask them to quiet down, and that helped as well. One time, my boyfriend and I were doing homework in the basement and heard the garage door open and voices of my parents in the kitchen. We ran up to say hi, only to discover an empty house. Another time, my boyfriend stayed overnight in our house and he slept in the living room. In the morning, he asked if we were all playing a joke on him at night, as he kept hearing a ball bounce on the stairwell leading up to the bedrooms on the second floor and in the kitchen. But every time he got up to see what was going on, no one was there. I don't think we even owned a ball, and we certainly didn't play with one in the house. One time, my mom heard a baby crying outside of our house at night. We lived in a safe and perfectly normal suburb. There was no reason that a baby would be in our backyard. Another day, a lid flew off of a cooking pot and got halfway embedded into the kitchen ceiling. It wasn't a pressure cooker, it was just a regular lid and pot. Another time, we left for a family vacation, and my boyfriend was asked to take our paper in. He said that he was in the house and decided to make my bed for me. We had left at the ungodly hour of 5 a.m., and I never got to it. He said at first he got a juice and felt like somebody was breathing down his neck in the kitchen. He kept turning around to find nobody there. Then he walked upstairs, and while he was making my bed, he felt something grab his legs from under it. He got freaked out and ran out of there, and he refused to enter the house again. He just diligently hid the papers behind a flower pot outside until we returned. One night, my sister woke up to a black caped figure standing silently in her room. She said there was also a bright orb near her window. Her windows faced the backyard and trees, and being on the second floor, there was no possible source of light from cars and things like that. She covered her head with the blanket, and when she looked out, the figure and the orb were still there. She went back under the blanket, and after some time, they were finally gone. One day, our cat disappeared without a trace, and we never did see it again. Not sure if that was related. My dad was one person who never experienced anything. No voices, no steps, no TV and radios blasting out on their own. He is hard of hearing, so that could be a factor. But one thing he can't explain is waking up at 4 a.m. next to a lit tea light candle that he swears burnt out at midnight. The candle was right in front of his face, and he's extremely sensitive to light, to the point where he covers any electronic lights with napkins because they disturb his sleep. It eventually got so bad that I refused to sleep in my own bedroom, as I could feel someone move around the room at night, and I slept in my sister's room. My dad decided to call a medium, and the guy said that there were 5 spirits in the house: a boy, an old lady, a couple, and a very angry man. He gave us a giant candle with a cross and said to burn it in the bedroom of the youngest child, which was now also my bedroom, where I slept in a sofa chair. The candle was in a big glass jar and was hefty. All night it kept shaking, and the glass kept making clicking noises against the counter that it stood on. We were also to tell the spirits that this was our house and that they needed to go to the light. Things improved after the visit, and shortly after I moved out to attend college, where I slept for years with the lights on, although I never experienced any paranormal activity in my apartment there. After college, I never stayed in the house for longer than a few days, always sleeping with the lights on, as that creepy feeling remained, although nothing notable happened anymore. Eventually, my parents sold the house. This happened when I was around 9 or 10. I was staying the night at my friend Catherine's for the first time. We met the summer before, and we'd been inseparable ever since. Kat lived in this old 2-story house, surrounded by woods and dirt roads. The house itself gave me an uneasy feeling when I first saw it. The shutters were falling off, the paint on the house seemed to be fading. It was an old piece of shit now that I think about it, but at the time, I was excited. I remember walking in after I stared out at the house for what seemed like 20 minutes. Surprisingly, the inside was a lot nicer than the outside, so I pushed that uneasy feeling down and just shrugged it off as nerves. I remember the smell of the house. I can't pinpoint it, but it was different, like walking into a musty room. I started to walk around, just to explore my surroundings, but I noticed Kat's mom watching me. I simply smiled and waved, but she just stood there, staring at me wide-eyed. I had never met her before, but I couldn't figure out why she was staring at me like that. Suddenly, Kat flew around the corner and tackled me. We both fell and started to giggle. I noticed Kat's mom out of the corner of my eye start to turn around and walk off. She was gone, just like that. Fast forward a couple of hours, Kat and I are laying on a beanbag in her room, watching Children of the Corn, which, by the way, was one of my favorite movies at the time. I grew up watching horror movies, mostly Stephen King movies or any movie my mom was watching at the time. Not her decision, mine, because I love the feeling that a good horror movie gives you. She felt the same way, and that's why we clicked so much. But back to the story. Kat and I were sitting here watching this movie, and suddenly the door opposite us slams closed. We both jumped, giggled, and brushed it off because, well, we were kids. Until the second time, when it creaked open and slammed again, not even seconds after the first time. Now, I'm sitting there staring at this door, trying to figure out how the hell this door is opening and closing by itself. In the midst of all that, the only other person in this house is her mom, who, I had figured out earlier, was just a tad bit creepy. "You think it's just your mom?" I asked her, but she just shook her head. "Are you sure?" I asked again. But then she said something that gave me chills, and still gives me chills thinking about it now. "My mom isn't home. It's just me and you, silly." I just stared at her while she was staring at me, trying to wrap my head around what she had just said. Who leaves their 9-year-old home alone with a friend they've never met in a 2-story house? "Where's your mom?" I asked her. "She's at work." I giggled, thinking that she was trying to trick me. "She is at work. She only works for a couple of hours, so she leaves me here because she trusts me." At this point, I'm just looking at her, and she notices the look of worry on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked. "If your mom is at work, then who was the lady staring at me earlier?" As I said this, we heard what seemed like footsteps at the time. But thinking about it now, it sounded more like shuffling in one spot, above us. I'm completely scared at this point. Every hair on my neck is standing up, and I just want to leave. I start to get up when Kat pulled me back down and asked me if I heard that noise. I nodded. It was silent again until the footsteps were back, but louder and faster. We both stared up at the ceiling, and she grabbed my hand. "This happens every day," she whispered. I look over at her, and I can truly see the fear on her face. The footsteps stopped, and she looked at me, her face flushed white. "Is there an attic?" I asked. She pointed up toward the ceiling. "Well, maybe it's just squirrels or birds," I kept thinking, over and over. You ever notice when you're really quiet, that's when you can hear almost everything around you? Imagine if you're sitting in a house with your best friend alone at 10 years old, and you hear the giggle of a 3-year-old child. Mind you, she has no younger brothers or sisters, and we're completely alone. Kat was just as scared as I was. I remember thinking that I just wanted to get out of this house. just grab her and run out the door. At least we would feel safer and less scared outside the house than in it. "Want to hear a story?" Kat asked, pulling my mind back to reality. I nodded. "Well, this house used to be a daycare. There was this lady that would watch the kids, and one day she just locked them in the attic and then hung herself from a rope in the kitchen. They all died because the kids were hungry and thirsty, and no one found them for months afterwards. It was this house." My heart started to pound and my eyes were wide with fear. I just looked at her. "It's true," she said. "I've seen them. The little kids, every day. But I've never seen the lady. You have, though. Earlier." After she told me this, I don't remember much else except running out the door of her room and making it outside the house. Kat followed, begging me to stay, but I just had to get out. My stomach felt like it was in knots, like I'd walked into a horror movie myself, and I just wished the entire day had never happened. Fast forward years later. That day was the last day I had seen or heard from Kat. I remember her always coming to play outside my dad's during the day. I remember what she looked like. I never remembered meeting her parents or seeing them out in public, though. I'm now 27, and I can't seem to find any proof that she exists. All my friends that I was friends with then, I'm still friends with now, even after all these years. So why not her? I've driven by that house maybe 15 times, and I still wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was one of the kids that never made it out. Where I live, we have had relatively few bid cases. There were almost none at all back in the fall. Because of that, although we were still living under certain restrictions, we had more public health sanctioned freedoms than many other places. For example, at the time, we were permitted to share our social bubble with one other household and travel within our region. My family and our fellow bubble family decided to take advantage of this by going on a fall getaway. We rented 2 side-by-side cabins in a beautiful waterfront wooded area and had a lovely, relaxing weekend. Although there were other cabins nearby, most were not occupied, and we saw no other people, although we did hear a dog barking a few times somewhere not far off. On our final night there, my son decided to sleep in the other cabin with his bubble siblings. Around 11 p.m., he called over, asking for some forgotten thing. It was a very dark night, and there were certainly no streetlights in the deeply wooded cabin area. So I grabbed my flashlight and walked the short distance to the neighboring cabin to deliver whatever it was that he needed. On the walk back, I heard a whistle. It was a very human-sounding whistle, exactly the kind of whistle one makes to call in a dog. It sounded very close, but shining my light around, I saw nobody. I heard it again, and assumed someone was whistling for the dog we'd heard earlier, so I didn't think much of it. A short time later, another call came from next door. My son couldn't settle and wanted to come back to our cabin. This time, my husband and I both walked over, collected our child and his stuff, said goodnight to our bubble family, and walked back. We heard the same whistle again, several times. It seemed to be on the dirt road ahead of us, moving gradually away. My husband commented that the dog must have gotten loose, and the owner was out looking for it. Inside our cabin, we continued to hear the whistling, coming at irregular intervals of maybe 2 to 4 minutes. At first, it would be loud and seemed quite nearby. Then, it would gradually grow fainter, then stop, as though the whistler had moved out of earshot. Then it would seem to circle around, coming from the other direction, getting louder as it moved past our cabin, then fading again into the distance. Then it would start all over again. Still not thinking much of it, my husband climbed into the loft to go to sleep, while I started to pack for the trip home the next day. Our son was sleeping in a little room on the main floor to the left of the front door, and the small window in his room was cracked open to let in the unseasonably warm night air. I was standing by that window, quietly gathering his scattered things, while the whistle once again drew closer. But this time, instead of fading as it passed by, the next one was very close and incredibly loud, as though the whistler was just outside my son's window. The blind was down, but I was sure someone was on the porch, right outside. I leapt to the front door, flung it open, and threw on the porch light, ready to tell off some prankster on our doorstep. Nobody was there. I grabbed my flashlight and took a few steps out past the circle of light, then thought better of it and retreated inside. I locked up the cabin, closed and latched all the windows, and lowered all the blinds. If someone was creeping around outside our cabin, I didn't want them looking in at us from the darkness. Deciding that I did not want to leave my sleeping son downstairs by himself, I settled on the sofa with a book. The whistles continued. Between each one, I would convince myself it was just a bird or an animal, only to hear it again and be certain that it could only be a human sound. The irregularity of it and the slight variations in pitch and tone also told me that it wasn't something mechanical or electrical or automated. Around 1:30 in the morning, my husband suddenly got up and started to get dressed. I asked him what he was doing. "I'm going to find out whoever that is and ask them why they've been whistling for hours," he said. I was horrified. My husband is a pretty big guy, and I was as curious as he was, but I also felt deep in my bones that it would not be safe for him to go outside that night. I insisted that he go back to bed, and thankfully he did. I sat vigil, listening to the intermittent whistles for at least another hour, until finally I dozed off on the sofa. When I awoke, it was morning. The sun was peeking around the blinds, and the whistling had stopped. I cautiously peered outside, half expecting to see some sort of evidence of a nightmare intruder, but there was none. A little while later, we wandered next door, coffee mugs in hand, to get our friends' take on the mystery whistler. Amazingly, they had not heard a thing, despite the fact that the sound was so clearly audible in our cabin and would have had to have passed right by them. We couldn't understand how they hadn't heard it. At checkout, I asked the woman at the kiosk down the road about it, but she just looked at me strangely and said she didn't know what it could have been. When I got home, I searched for audios of bird calls common to the area, and then ones not common to the area, in the hope of finding that same whistle. Nothing I found was even close, and we still don't know what we heard that night, circling for hours and stopping just outside our cabin door.